February 1903, Caracas. President Castro stares at a document. 30% of the country's income now belongs to someone else. 2 months ago, he was sure he was untouchable. Now he is signing his surrender. Rewind 2 months. December 9th, 1902. Off the coast of Venezuela, 11 warships from 3 empires appear on the horizon. Germany wants $2 million in unpaid loans. Britain wants compensation. Italy wants its contracts honored. What followed? 4 Venezuelan warships sunk. Ports blockaded. An economy strangled in weeks. No war was declared. No territory was taken. This was debt collection, with cannons. This is the story of how money became a weapon, how a president who laughed at bankers signed away his country, and why the rules that changed in 1902 are still in use today. How did Castro get there? October 1899. The Andes. Cipriano Castro starts with 60 men. No uniforms, no artillery, just rifles, machetes, and a promise. Whoever follows him to Caracas will share in the spoils. The march takes 3 months. They cross mountains where mules die from altitude. They fight 17 skirmishes. By the time they reach the capital, the 60 have become several thousand. Peasants, deserters, opportunists who smelled which way the wind was blowing. The government collapses before Castro even enters the city. President Andrade flees to the coast, then to exile. October 22, 1899. Castro rides into Caracas on a white horse. He is 41 years old. He cannot read French. He has never seen a steamship up close, but he understands one thing perfectly. The men who helped him take the palace will expect payment. And payment requires money. The money is in the ports. The new president is not a diplomat. He came to power through the mountains, machete in hand. Now he runs the country. Castro didn't speak foreign languages. He'd never been to Europe. He didn't understand how banks work. But he understood force, and he knew how to use it. He was short, stocky, with a thick mustache and eyes that never seemed to blink. Foreign diplomats described him as provincial and uncultured. He took it as a compliment. His first act as president, a banquet. His second act, arrests. 17 officers who had served the previous regime disappeared within a week. Their property was redistributed to Castro's allies. The message was clear. Loyalty paid. Disloyalty cost everything. The people around him changed fast. Those who hesitated disappeared. Those who agreed got positions. The system was simple. Loyalty in exchange for access to money. One man agreed more than others. Juan Vicente Gomez. Gomez was Castro's opposite in temperament. Where Castro was loud, Gomez was silent. Where Castro made speeches, Gomez made lists of enemies, of debts owed, of favors to be collected later. Castro made him vice president, a reward for loyalty. Or so Castro believed. Gomez watched, waited, took notes. His time would come, and the money flowed through the ports. On his desk, a stack of letters, German banks demanding $2 million, British companies demanding $3 million in compensation, Italians demanding payment on contracts signed by the previous regime. Total claims, over $12 million. The entire state budget was only $25 million. Castro reads, sets it aside. Next, sets it aside. Castro's answer to every demand was the same. Later. Not a refusal, a postponement. That will be his strategy for 3 years. And for 3 years, it will work. In Caracas, debt was a political problem, not a threat. The logic was simple. Debts mean negotiation, not warships. And even if Europe tried something, the Americans would never allow it. That assumption felt solid. It wasn't. In December 1901, the German chargé d'affaires delivered a note. The tone had changed. These weren't requests, they were demands with consequences implied. Castro read it, smirked. set it aside. The note went into the pile with the rest. The foreign minister carefully pointed out the tone was unusual. The Germans hadn't written like this before. Castro looked at him. If the response was another piece of paper, he knew how to delay. The minister said nothing. Castro was certain of one thing. The Americans would never allow European warships in the Caribbean. He was half right. The Americans would allow them, under conditions Castro never imagined. He didn't know that in Berlin they were already discussing something other than paper. At home, this posture even strengthened his power. Debt became a symbol of outside pressure. Resisting creditors became defending sovereignty. The ability to pay slid into the background. What mattered more was how refusal looked. European creditors seemed fragmented. Different countries, different banks. They'd argue with each other longer than they'd argue with Venezuela. No unified front, no real threat. Caracas saw debt as politics. Creditors saw it as a revenue stream, one that either performs or gets forcibly extracted. Venezuela lost this story before the warships appeared. It lost when it mistook a habit for a guarantee. For Venezuelan authorities, foreign debt remained a matter of dispute and delay. For European creditors, it looked very different. The numbers were brutal. Up to 70% of state revenue flowed through customs. External debt exceeded the annual budget several times over. And there were many creditors, German banks, British companies, Italian contractors, each with their own claims. Because they weren't looking at the political situation in Caracas or at government statements. They were looking at the source of money, and they saw one specific stream that could be shut down. The claims were not abstract. They had names. The Diskonto Gesellschaft Bank in Berlin, $1.4 million in unpaid bonds issued under President Crespo in 1896. The interest alone was now larger than the original loan. The Great Venezuelan Railway Company, British-owned, $2.8 million in compensation for a line that Castro's government had seized for national security. The Orinoco Steamship Company, also British, damages from a civil war that had disrupted traffic for 18 months. Italian contractors who had built roads and bridges under the previous regime and been paid in promissory notes that were never honored. Each creditor had lawyers. Each lawyer had files. And every file told the same story. Venezuela had signed, Venezuela had promised, Venezuela had not paid. For 3 years, the response from Caracas had been silence, delays, and counterclaims. Now the creditors wanted something more convincing than paper. Autumn 1902. London, the Foreign Office. Count Metternich, the German ambassador, laid out Berlin's position. Lord Lansdowne, the British Foreign Secretary, listened. The Italian envoy, Marquis di San Giuliano, took notes. For the first time, the creditors were coordinating. The room smelled of coal smoke and old paper. Rain streaked the windows. Outside, London carried on. Carriages, umbrellas, the Empire's business as usual. Inside, 3 men were planning something that had never been done before. The Germans wanted firmness. Their banks had lost the most. The British hesitated. Reputation. The Italians were nervous. The scale was intimidating. Lansdowne's position was clear. Participate, but do not lead. Let the Germans absorb the reputational blow. Count Metternich was blunt. German banks had lost more than anyone. The Kaiser was displeased. What was needed were results, not correspondence. "We've waited 3 years," he said. "How much longer do you propose we wait?" The Italian flipped through his papers. His country's claims were smaller, but the principle was the same. Money was lent, money was not returned. Silence hung in the room. "There is one way," the Brit said, "but it requires Washington's consent." Silence. The question was simple. How do you make someone pay when they refuse? The answer, a blockade. The plan was straightforward. 3 fleets appear simultaneously. Ports are closed. Venezuela loses revenue. Within weeks, Caracas gives in. What they didn't plan for was how fast it would work. On paper, it was arithmetic. In practice, it would be the first time debt became a pretext for naval action. One question remained: the United States. In November 1902, German Ambassador Theodor von Holleben delivered an inquiry to Secretary of State John Hay. Would the United States object to naval action? Hay's response, approved by Roosevelt, was careful. The U.S. would not interfere, provided there was no acquisition of territory, but no occupation. In Berlin, what they heard was no objection. The wording was careful. Neither approval nor prohibition. A legal construction that allowed every side to read it as it wished. For Berlin, it was permission. For London, it was cover. If something went wrong, American consent could be cited. For Roosevelt himself, it was a test. He wanted to see how far the Europeans were prepared to go, and what to do with the consequences. The Monroe Doctrine barred European expansion in the Americas. But a blockade was not expansion. That technically turned out to be enough. Roosevelt had his own calculations. Germany was rising. Its navy was growing. The Kaiser talked openly about a place in the sun. If Germany established a foothold in Venezuela, even temporarily, what came next? A coaling station? A naval base? A permanent presence 90 miles from the Panama Canal that Roosevelt was already planning to build? Better to let them collect their debts and leave. Better to watch, measure their ambitions, and prepare a response. The Monroe Doctrine would survive this test, but it would need updating. In Caracas, had they known, they would have said, "We were sold out." But Caracas did not know. Not until a fleet appeared off its coast. Venezuela had one financial artery: customs. It provided 70% of state revenue. Every day the ports stayed closed, the country lost $50,000. The government in Caracas saw a political dispute. The creditors in London and Berlin saw a target. When a state relies on a single flow of money, does it really own its sovereignty? Or is it just renting it? The line of what was acceptable was about to move. In Berlin, they saw it differently. Kaiser Wilhelm II, as the story goes, put it with brutal clarity: debts must be paid. For him, this wasn't ideology, and it wasn't colonial ambition. It was arithmetic. Venezuela believed something else. There is a limit, a line pressure will not cross. Europeans would not dare use force in the Western Hemisphere over debts. The problem was that these rules existed in interpretation, not in wording. Venezuela assumed that any European naval presence would automatically count as intervention. But in reality, the international system didn't judge force in the abstract. It judged the form it took. What mattered was the distinction between occupation and coercion, between taking territory and applying temporary pressure, between changing a political regime and creating conditions in which that regime is forced to yield on its own. And it was inside that gap, between forms of force, that a possibility emerged Venezuela never priced in. November 1902. Washington, the State Department. The office was cluttered. Maps, cables, a half-eaten sandwich on the desk. Secretary Hay had been at work since 6 in the morning. The German inquiry had arrived the night before. He reads it a second time, then a third. "They're asking permission," he says finally. Roosevelt looks up from his papers. He had been drafting a message to Congress about conservation, forests, national parks, the future. Now he was being asked about warships in the Caribbean. "No," Roosevelt says. "They're asking if we'll stop them." A pause. Outside, a clerk's typewriter clattered. "Will we?" Roosevelt sets down his pen. Thinks. The Monroe Doctrine said no European colonies in the Americas. But this wasn't colonization. This was, what? Debt collection. Temporary, surgical. Not if they leave when they're done. Hay nodded slowly. He understood. They both did. That sentence would cost Venezuela everything. For Washington, the crucial issue was not the ships themselves, but the purpose behind them. Annexation was unacceptable. Permanent control of territory was unacceptable. Regime change was dangerous. But a temporary measure aimed at collecting debts did not look like an existential threat. It didn't redraw the map. It didn't create new colonies. It didn't, on paper, violate sovereignty. The question shifted. It was no longer, can force be used for debt? The question was, can force be used in a way that doesn't look like war? The answer was yes. If you leave the flag flying in the cabinet meeting, you can claim sovereignty is intact, even while you rewrite the country's economic reality from the outside. Cipriano Castro was about to discover how fast that reality could shatter. The mechanism was about to switch on. And once a tool like this is normalized, how do you ever unnormalize it? Castro believed he would outlast the pressure. He was wrong, not just about the blockade, but about what came after. Once the line of the acceptable had shifted, what followed no longer unfolded like a political dispute. It unfolded like a well-drilled operation. December 9, 1902. La Guaira, Venezuela's main port. The same morning, Caracas, the presidential palace. Castro was eating breakfast when the first report arrived. A messenger, out of breath, mud on his boots. Ships, Señor Presidente. Foreign ships, many of them. Castro set down his coffee. How many? They say 11. German flags, British, Italian. For a moment, Castro said nothing. Then he laughed. Let them sit there. The Americans will send them home. He returned to his breakfast. Eggs, arepa, black coffee, the meal of a man who believed he was untouchable. By noon, he would stop laughing. On the horizon, silhouettes. Germany, 4, including the cruiser Veneta. Britain, 5. Italy, 3. 11 ships, 3 fleets, 1 purpose. For the first time, creditors moved in sync, not one after another, together. The blockade began. On December 9th, German forces seized 4 Venezuelan vessels in the harbor. The next day, 2 were sunk. Commercial vessels stopped. Ports went still. Then came escalation. The Crispin Restaurador, one of Venezuela's few warships, tried to break out. The Germans opened fire without warning. The ship went down. December 13th, the bombardment of Fort San Carlos. In Caracas, shock. Crowds in the streets, resist. But with what? The fleet was gone. The money was in the ports, and the ports were closed. The country was suffocating. On the 3rd day of the blockade, Caracas ran out of kerosene. Lamps went out one by one. The city fell into darkness earlier than usual. On the 5th day, bread prices jumped. Flour came through the ports. And now there were no ports. On the 7th day, the first riot. A bakery on the Calle Real was looted. The police fired into the crowd. 3 dead. Castro ordered the bodies removed before dawn. On the 10th day, layoffs began. Trading houses shut their doors. There was nothing to pay workers with. On the 14th day, a delegation of merchants came to the palace. They begged Castro to negotiate. He had them arrested for defeatism. On the 20th day, even his generals began to whisper. The army was still being paid. Castro understood this was the last thing he could not cut. But the treasury drained with every passing day. Foreign consuls sent dispatches. The situation is deteriorating. The government is losing control. The end is near. Castro read intercepted messages. He knew what they were writing about him. He knew they were waiting for him to fall. But he had no intention of falling. He intended to negotiate. On his terms, that was no longer possible. 2 months, 60 days, from a smirk to a signature. February 13, 1903. Washington. Herbert Bouvin, the American minister to Venezuela, signed the protocols on Castro's behalf. The terms were brutal. 30% of customs revenue under international control. A creditor's commission would sit in Venezuelan ports and take the money directly. In Caracas, the cable arrived at noon. Castro read the number, 30%, for at least 10 years. The terms went further. A mixed commission, Europeans and Americans, would sit in Venezuelan customs houses. They would count every crate, every barrel, every sack of coffee that passed through. They would take their 30% before a single bolivar reached Caracas. If Venezuela missed a payment, the commission could increase its share. If Venezuela objected, the warships could return. It was not occupation. It was something more elegant. It was control without responsibility, profit without governance, empire without the inconvenience of administration. Castro stared at the terms. He had two choices: sign or watch his country starve. He signed. 2 months earlier, he had laughed at notes. Now he set down the paper, looked out the window. Beyond the glass, the same city he had taken 4 years earlier with 60 men and a mountain march. And now, a signature in another country's capital. This was not surrender in war. There had been no war. This was surrender in accounting. The country was no longer his. He had entered Caracas with 60 men and a machete. He was leaving it with a signature and a percentage. The creditors won. The real winner was not in the room. It was Roosevelt. No troops landed, no cities fell. On paper, the state remained intact, but the revenue vanished instantly. A blockade doesn't need time for slow attrition. It is a sharp severing of reality. When imports collapse and the treasury drains by the hour, even the strongest government begins to crack. The precedent was set. A fleet could be used not to start a war, but to collect a debt. The boundary between economics and force had just been erased. What conclusion would the rest of the world draw? The most important outcome of Venezuela's 1902 crisis was not the blockade itself. In Berlin, satisfaction. The mechanism worked. It could be used again. In London, relief and unease. The money returned. But the precedent was too loud. In Washington, irritation. The Europeans had done what they were not supposed to do. Now there would have to be a response. Roosevelt summoned his advisors. The blockade had been more effective than he expected. Europe had gained money and a precedent. That was dangerous. If Germany could send a fleet to Venezuela, what stopped it from doing the same to the Dominican Republic? To Haiti? To any country with debt? And everyone had debt. In Mexico City, President Diaz read the news and quietly accelerated payments to European bondholders. No delays, no excuses. He understood the lesson. In Rio de Janeiro, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry sent urgent cables to London. We are not Venezuela. We pay our debts. Please note this. In Bogota, in Lima, in Santiago, the same fear. If this could happen to Venezuela, it could happen to anyone. The rules had changed, or rather, the real rules had been revealed. In his 1904 address to Congress, Roosevelt declared that the United States would exercise international police power in the Western Hemisphere to prevent Europeans from having a reason to intervene. 2 years later, he formulated the Roosevelt Corollary. The U.S. claimed the right to intervene in Latin American states to maintain order. In Buenos Aires, alarm. Argentina's Foreign Minister, Luis Drago, advanced a principle. Sovereign debt cannot be grounds for armed intervention. The great powers listened politely and then ignored him. In 1904, a final arbitration awarded $2.3 million to the blockading powers. It established a chilling rule. Creditors who use force get paid first. In 1908, Cipriano Castro left for medical treatment in Europe. His vice president, Juan Vicente Gómez, seized power immediately. Gómez's first move was to come to terms with the creditors. He ruled for 27 years. The irony is sharp. The man who smirked at creditors lost his country not to debt, but to his own logic. Power taken by force is taken by force. Castro spent the rest of his life in exile: Paris, Madrid, then Paris again. The details of his final years were pitiful. He lived in a cheap boarding house. He wrote letters to old allies, letters that were never answered. He plotted returns that never happened. Once, in 1913, he chartered a ship to take him back to Venezuela. Gómez's agents were waiting at the dock. The ship turned around. He grew fat, bitter, and forgotten. The man who had once commanded armies now argued with landladies over rent. He died in Puerto Rico in 1924. No money, no country, no army. The man who mocked banks didn't even leave behind a decent inheritance. When he died, the Venezuelan government did not send condolences. Gómez was still in power. He would rule until 1935, longer than Castro had ever dreamed. Castro's body returned to Venezuela 40 years later, when he could no longer threaten anyone. The 1902 blockade showed that a fleet can be the continuation of a credit agreement. In 1915, the U.S. occupied Haiti for 19 years for the same reason: debts. Sovereignty no longer looked absolute. It became conditional. You are free as long as you meet your obligations. Your flag can fly, but if you do not control your revenue, you do not control your reality. The Venezuelan crisis of 1902 is rarely described as a turning point. More often, it's framed as a narrow dispute, an episode of the imperial age, a strange story from a time when great powers still allowed themselves too much. But if you strip away the dates and the country names, what remains is a template that never went away. A state can look sovereign. It can have a government, an army, laws, a flag, and a capital. It can run domestic politics, crush rebellions, reshuffle elites, even clash with neighbors. But if its economic life rests on a single external flow, that flow becomes the point of vulnerability, and whoever can control it gains power stronger than any diplomacy. In 1902, that flow was trade, customs, ports, sea routes. They were cut, and the state became helpless without ever being formally defeated. Sovereignty was not abolished. It was bypassed. And that was the lesson. Old empires fought for land. A newer kind of empire fights for flows: money, routes, credit, infrastructure, clearing systems. Venezuela became one of the first examples of how financial obligations can be enforced not by courts and not by negotiation, but by military power, disguised as a technical measure. From that point on, the world was different. Not instantly, not loudly, but irreversibly, because a simple principle was demonstrated. If pressure can be applied in a way that does not look like war, it will be applied again. And each time, the boundary of what is acceptable shifts a little farther. That is why this story is not about the past. It is about mechanics, about how debt becomes a lever, and the lever becomes normal, about how a state can lose without losing a war, and about how financial dependence is dangerous not when there is too little money, but when control over it sits outside the country. The Venezuelan crisis showed something uncomfortable. An empire does not have to die from bullets or revolutions. It can die from accounting, from the moment numbers begin to weigh more than a flag. And if you watch a dispute over money today slowly turn into pressure, sanctions, or temporary measures, you already know how this usually ends. Because the rules that shifted in 1902 were never repealed. They simply learned to look more modern. Today, no one sends gunboats. There is no need. Consider Greece, 2015, a European democracy, an EU member. The people held a referendum and voted no to creditor terms. A week later, the banks were closed. 2 weeks later, the government signed the agreement anyway. There were no warships, just a central bank that controlled the liquidity. Or consider Argentina, 2012. A hedge fund, not a government, not an army. A hedge fund obtained a court order to seize an Argentine naval vessel in a Ghanaian port. The ship was collateral for unpaid bonds. a warship, captured by lawyers for debt. The Libertad sat in Tema harbor for 2 months while diplomats negotiated. The symbolism was perfect. A vessel named Freedom, held hostage by a spreadsheet. In 1902, creditors needed 11 warships. In 2012, they needed 1 judge. And today, SWIFT shuts off faster than a fleet can sail. Sanctions can be imposed in a day. Reserves can be frozen with a single decision. The mechanism has changed. The logic has not. If your main financial flow runs through a system you do not control, you are vulnerable. It does not matter what your constitution says. It does not matter how large your army is. What matters is who controls the button. Venezuela in 1902 learned that when ships appeared on the horizon. Countries in the 21st century learn it when bank transfers stop working. The outcome is the same. Only the speed has changed. The Venezuelan crisis of 1902 was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. Every generation since has seen the same mechanism applied, with new names, new justifications, new technical systems, but the logic never changes. Find the flow of money, threaten to cut it, and watch sovereignty dissolve. The only question is whether you recognize the pattern before it's applied to you. Write in the comments. Which modern country do you see in Venezuela's position in 1902? Who today is still sure they can say they won't dare?